Firing managers of Reddit. What was your favorite firing? Story 1. I fired this girl without the permission of my company once. Essentially, I had been told to hold on to a freelancer through the holiday push, utilizing her desire to get a full-time role to ask her to sacrifice her own Christmas to make up for all the extra work of the season, e-commerce. I was informed that we weren't going to offer her a full-time job though, and I knew she had another full-time offer with the other company she was freelancing for. She'd been holding out to work at my company and was at risk of losing the other offer while she was waiting to see what my company would do. Of course, they hadn't told her they weren't going to hire her. They instead asked me to imply that she would get an offer with a good enough holiday push. They were going to say any amount of work she did wasn't enough to get the offer and let her lose a real offer in the meantime. I essentially pulled her into an office and told her it was in her best interest to accept the other offer and quit on the spot. I was pulled into a room with the CEO and some others to justify why she'd quit after talking to me, but I just couldn't have it on my conscience. She took the other job and we made it through the holiday without her. I managed the team she was freelancing for, so I absorbed most of that extra work, but I'm so glad I chased her away instead of lying to her. Story 2. I fired my best friend in high school. He knew it was coming though. The night before, we had been hanging out at the arcade. It was the 80s, and when we went to leave, his car wouldn't start. He was scheduled to work the next day and told me that night he wouldn't be in as he had to work on his car. The next day comes, I'm opening the restaurant and he didn't show up. I called the manager and she said he was fired. I called him and told him he was fired. He picked me up after work and we hung out some more. Easiest firing ever. Story 3. My absolute favorite was a guy my boss hired who was an absolute whiz in the shipping department. He'd find people on the golf course, talk with them while golfing, and hire them. The guy comes in and I learn he's been hired with a quick phone call to my manager, so I get all his paperwork filled out and send it over to HR. Give him a good orientation on the company rules, break times, lunch, etc., then walk him back to shipping. Jake is my manager back there and a good guy. He's not the fastest, but he shows up every day, does an adequate job, and almost never makes a mistake. And if he does, he fixes it without being a little bit. I hand off the new guy and go back to work. A little over an hour, it's break time, and I go see how the new guy's doing. I stop in with Jake and he says the new guy's out back and says nothing more. I find the new guy out back smoking a bowl. He looks up at me, clearly stoned, and says, "Hey, computer dude, what's up?" Me. "Come up front. I need to fill out some paperwork for you. I'm letting you go for violating our drug policy. The policy I read to you about 90 minutes ago?" Him. "Dude, that's fucked up. I quit." Story 4. He used to manage a pizzeria, had a shift leader that told me he needed to leave because his son went to the ER. This was like 10 minutes into his shift. I let him leave and closed the store myself. His wife came in to pick up his paycheck a few days later, and I asked if everything was okay with their son after the ER visit. She had no idea what I was talking about. Fired him 10 minutes into his next shift. Story 5. I had a repo man working for me who was enormous and had some anger issues. He'd stopped making his daily runs and was tuning in false trip reports. I called him into my office to discuss the situation with him, and it rapidly turned into him yelling at me, including phrases like, "You're not my dad." Weird, I know. Anyway, my boss came in to try to calm him down and told him to go home, and then come back the next morning to discuss the situation. As soon as the repo man was gone, I told my boss that I was firing him if he came back. My boss told me that he'd take care of it because things would get too messy if I did it, which may have been accurate at the time. I was instructed to stay home the next morning so that the boss could talk to the repo guy. I came in at around 10:30 a.m. and there were 3 cop cars in our parking lot, and as I walked up to the building, our repo man was being dragged out in cuffs and cursed out one of our salespeople who just happened to be walking by. When I got inside, I found the boss's office thoroughly trashed, with chairs and paperwork everywhere. I'm sure glad that I wasn't there to make things messy. The repo man called another manager who was a friend of mine looking for a job the next week. Story 6. I got one. Let's call him Jeff. Jeff was a fucking nutcase. I'm certain he spent the entire 80s in coke and doing karate. I didn't hire Jeff. My boss did. I was his direct manager. Jeff didn't have a house. He lived in an RV, which he ended up parking on the property. Cool, whatever. So I start to train Jeff on his daily duty in the shop. This is where living in an RV starts to make some sense. On days, it was me, another employee, and Jeff. We had a moment to rest as our busy time ended, so I sit at my desk and start doing paperwork. While my great employee and Jeff start to talk, Jeff starts his story along the lines of, "You ever watch Miami Vice?" Another employee, John. "Yeah, I've seen it." "That was based on me, man. I was Miami Vice undercover. I've seen some shit, man," Jeff says to him. I glance up from my desk and see him walking over to the mop bucket and picking up the mop. He then starts screeching and doing the worst moves I've ever seen with it, like some cracked out white ninja that had forgotten anything he'd ever learned about anything. I see John trying his hardest not to laugh. I follow suit and try. I get a grip and ask, "Why aren't you a cop anymore?" To which he replied, "Because it was a bunch of politics and I was a loose cannon," he says as he put the mop back. I said, "You don't say." Then listened as he told his story about riding a motorcycle in circa 1980s Miami as he was trying to take down a crime lord. My boss did this sort of thing. He'd hire people, anyone really, then give them to me to train and manage them. He had the ability to pick out the most insane people in the state. He lasted 2 weeks. I came in to watch the previous night's tapes. I had to review them daily in order to ensure no theft had happened due to employees stealing a lot. There he was, Jeff in all his vice glory, standing in a hallway in the middle of the night, doing his crack karate with a mop stick. He then went on patrol with it in the parking lot. Some customers complained, and I let him go. My boss hired, trained, and fired those who couldn't make the cut. It flipped out, as you'd think. Cops were called, and we ended up banning him from the property as he would sneak on every night and sabotage things. That's another story, though. Story 7. In our deli, we had a girl named Jessie, who worked for us for about 8 months before she realized she wasn't going to get the experience pay a shitty HR promised her and decided to get another job. But she wanted to stay on board with one foot in the door, just in case what she had didn't pan out so well. So asked to work 1 day a week. This was fine by us. She was a good worker and we could use the extra help, so she decided to work Sunday evenings. It soon became clear that Jessie really wasn't feeling it. Her work ethic dipped. She spent more time on her phone and she called off. One night she asked to go home early, and when a manager wouldn't let her because the rest of the staff would suffer for it, she just left anyways. The next week she came back and we told her she couldn't behave like that. It's unfair to her coworkers, but she blew us off like it was no big deal. The next week she doesn't show up at all. We call her and she doesn't answer, so we assume she's finally done. I tell management to make moves to terminate her. We usually don't bother with formalities, but I was a bit miffed at how she had so easily disrespected her coworkers and tired of her bullshit. Almost 2 whole months passed without any mention of Jessie, when suddenly one day I get a call from the front office. Jessie's here asking for an override to clock in. I go up front and yep, there she stands in her uniform, ready to clock in. I burst out laughing and told her she doesn't work here anymore. And to my great shock, she was actually pissed off. She says the deal was she would work Sundays. Yeah, and you haven't called or shown up for the last 8 in a row. She tries to call the union, who tells her that more than 3 no-calls, no-shows in a row mean voluntary quitting. We were free to terminate her, and she couldn't fight it after the 3rd week. She got so flushed and angry and said, "That's not fair. I didn't know that." Watching her storm off was pretty satisfying. Learning she had her hours cut from her new job and wanted to come back from a coworker close to her was even better. Folks, moving up is great, but don't burn your bridges. Story 8. I hired an employee who was close friends with my other employee. They're in their early 20s and have recently graduated college. Claudia is super responsible. So responsible, in fact, that I start letting her watch my home when I am out of town. Her friend Mitch is fiercely intelligent, great with customers, and has great sales while she's at my business, but she calls in at the last minute an awful lot, always claiming she has suddenly been stricken ill and is herself, vomiting everywhere, and so on and so forth. On numerous occasions, she would pull this at the last minute, resulting in me having to cancel meetings to go to work, have family obligations, or close my business for that day. The last straw was during a major shopping holiday. She agrees to work. It's a short shift, maybe 4 hours. She starts calling me and texting me at 4 a.m., which I don't get because I'm asleep. From 4 a.m. to 9:45, I have 15 texts telling me she has been stricken ill and she's shitting on herself and vomiting everywhere. I call her back. I'm furious because I am 99.9% certain she's faking. I fire her and tell her to give the key back to Claudia. 30 minutes after I got off the phone with her, she started posting Facebook pictures of her night out drinking downtown. Later, Claudia, who now has a real job and whom I consider a friend, tells me that her friend was just hungover that day and didn't want to come in. She said she wasn't even sick. Since then, she had called me asking for her job back. Story 9. This isn't necessarily a favorite, but it happened. Several years ago, I was a bank branch manager. I was being transferred to another branch across town and had to fire a teller on my first day in the branch. About a month before, the teller had cashed out a bad check for a few $1,000s. He didn't check the correct ID and let the money walk out the door. Shortly after, before the mistake was found, he was in a car accident and had to miss a few weeks of work. He was due to return to work the same day as my first day in the branch. My regional manager had told me about the situation, but they couldn't fire him because he hadn't been back to work since they found out. So that morning, I came in, said, "Nice to meet you. Come sit down. You're fired." Story 10. I worked in fast food for years from high school through college, and was in management for the majority of it. As a manager, I fired way too many people to count. Most of them just didn't want to do the basics. Show up on time, try and do a good job. Over the years, I was asked to help clean up a few stores. I went in and found out who was busting their ass to pick up others' slack. I would give that person a good raise and either fire or cut the hours of the slackers. The store would take off in a positive direction. The guys busting ass have more money and are happy. The customers are getting better service and are happy. The morale of the entire store goes up. The owner is happy because he is saving labor and seeing more revenue. Happy owners tend to give out more perks to everyone, so firing the bad apples was pretty easy as it made a lot more people happy. What amazed me is the parents that would get their kids fired. We had scheduled and everyone had to put in time off. Parents would call in and say their kid wasn't going to be there because they just decided to go out of town that weekend. They thought the job was some sort of after-school club. Story 11. We had a starving, stifled artist type millennial who worked for us. A typical self-entitled kid who played the race card a lot. The funny thing, he was working security, so it wasn't really a hard or demanding position. We worked nights, but he thought that sleeping during the day was wasteful, so he wouldn't get much sleep at all. So it turned into him sleeping on breaks, sleeping on his lunch, and then falling asleep wherever he could put his head. So I was constantly waking him up when he didn't check back in from breaks or his lunches, and find him out cold, where a hard shake was needed to wake him up. Over time, this got old, and we started to write him up. 3 of those, and it was termination time. Except at our level, we couldn't terminate, so it was a suspended pending investigation, then HR would call them the next day and make it official. So I had to wake him up 3 times when he was 45 minutes late getting back from his lunch. We get him into the office, and as we're doing the paperwork for his suspension, he falls asleep and falls into me. We're at the corner of my desk with him beside it. I put my hand on his forehead and push him back into his chair. He wakes up and accuses me of assault. We had a camera and audio along with 2 others in the office watching this. He falls asleep 2 more times and I push him off of me and back into his chair each time. So we get the paper signed, he gets all pissy, and we escort him out the door. 5 minutes later, we have a guest telling us there's a car horn going off solid in the parking lot. Sure enough, he fell asleep at the wheel. So we get him a cab ride home and that was it. For the record, he had no health issues. He just refused to sleep during the day because cool people never did that. Story 12. I had to fire someone who I was friends with enough that we had hung out a few times outside of work. It really sucked, and I didn't really want to fire her, but my hands were tied. I won't go into details, but writing her up or giving her a warning was not an option. It makes for a great story though, so I guess I would say it was my favorite. I sat down with her and HR for a private meeting. An HR person always needs to be present for this kind of thing, but they basically just sit in on them and witness it. I laid out what was happening and why, with the evidence I had collected that led up to her termination. She started crying about it, which made the HR person uncomfortable and a bit unsure if this was the right move. The HR representative asked the employee to step outside for a minute so we could discuss it further. The HR rep expresses her concern that this might be too much, and in most cases, we need to have documented warnings before firing anyone, and in this case, we had not done so. She told me that it was nothing personal against me, but she wanted to talk to my boss about it as well before she signed off on anything. I said this was not a problem, as he and I had already discussed it at length, to decide if we could afford to let her go with a warning. Neither of us really wanted to lose her, but we ultimately decided termination was the only option. The HR rep rings up my boss while the employee is outside. He answers the phone, but instead of saying, "Hello," simply says, "She started crying, didn't she?" I guess my boss was confident enough in her ability to cry on command that he predicted how the meeting would go. He quickly confirmed that we had discussed it and we had his approval and finished up with the employee. Since people love a happy ending, I'll also share that the next time I saw that employee, she gave me a big hug and told me she was doing well, had no hard feelings, etc. I told her the story about the phone call to my boss when we asked her to step out, and she thought it was hilarious. Story 13. I'm not a firing manager, but I aided in the firing of one woman. I was working in a restaurant in a small town at the time, so everyone knows each other's business. Or so I'd think. They hired this lady named Jenna, we'll call her. No one knew of her history but me. She and her husband stole hundreds of dollars worth of tools from my dad's auto mechanic shop 5 years back. She also will purposefully trigger her son's autistic attacks in public as a distraction to steal things. Anyway, I was super nervous as I had to train her and she knew damn well whose daughter I am. She played dumb and I played dumb back. I decided I'd give her a second chance, maybe she got clean and needed one. I was wrong. The money would fall out of her bra all the time. We were hostesses so we didn't get direct tips, even after she'd put her wallet away. She also chased a customer down for a smoke, aka pills, and was so loopy she had to get sent home. They were gonna train her to be a manager. Finally, the other managers caught on she was stealing the waitress's tips after bussing tables and came forward. She never realized in her drugged up state they had cameras everywhere and I was able to identify when and where she was stealing. She got fired that night. That's what you get for stealing from my dad, bitch. Also, she introduced me to a Hell's Angel leader. His wife asked if I would join an MLM with her. I've never noped so quickly in my life. Story 14. I wasn't a firing manager, but I was told by the manager to let this girl know she didn't need to come back in. I worked at a small family-owned restaurant, and it was a Saturday morning or early afternoon, and I was the only waitress working that shift. I had heard my manager complaining about her the week before because she wouldn't stay off her phone long enough to wait on her tables, and just wasn't doing a good job in general. The floor manager had taken the girl's shift off the schedule and failed to tell her. So when she walked into work, they told me to tell her to go home. I was a 17-year-old kid, and this girl was about a year younger than me and knew me before we even worked together. When I told her the news, she goes emotionally crazy. She wants me to tell her exactly why she's being fired, why no one told her until now, and what to do. Holds me up for about 20 minutes. Luckily, there weren't any customers that come in yet, until finally, I guess the manager sent someone to tell her to quit wasting our time, let me go back to work, and go home. She just looked at them, then back at me, and said, "Well, I guess I'll just go to the grocery store down the road. They'll give me a job because they know I'll be a good worker." Turns out my manager accidentally marked her shift off the schedule and she really was supposed to work, but that was going to be her last day because the owner told my manager to fire her anyway. The grocery store didn't give her the job either. Story 15. I worked for a security company for over 2 years before quitting to become an EMT, this being last year. During my last 5 months on the job, I was promoted to third shift supervisor. We were contracted out to a large factory that also had a janitorial and maintenance company contracted out as well. Whenever any employee was to be fired, they would be brought out to our guard shack in front of us to be told the bad news, where we in turn would escort them to their vehicle. So there's a young guy, we'll call Jay, that works for the janitorial company, and he's probably the laziest employee in the whole planet. Today was the final straw for his supervisor since he sent Jay to clean the north end locker rooms and he spent the entire shift sleeping instead. They call Jay into the guard shack, tell him he's fired, and I stand there ready to escort him out. Right after Jay heard the bad news, he does an about face, walks right past me, and stops at the front desk to ask my security guard if he can have an application for our company. His former boss and I yelled, "No!" in complete unison. They got to fire someone before they were even hired.